Good morning, everyone. My name is Fred Combs, and I'd like to welcome you to the July meeting of the Lextran Board of Directors. I'm here to lead the meeting. It's our chair, Mr. Harding Dow.
Thank you, Fred. We'll call the meeting to order, and we will call the roll. Ms. Rogers is absent. Ms. Berry is absent. Mr. Scheininger is absent. Judge Thurston is absent. Ms. Borges-Gonzalez.
I'm here.
Mr. Ward is absent. And Dr. Acapo.
Yeah.
Okay. Seeing as we do not have quorum, we will avoid the approval of the minutes at this time. Is there any? Oh, Jamie is here. Okay. Well, sorry. You just caught the end of the roll there, Jamie. So you are present, but we are still short of quorum. Is there any public comment on agenda items? Mr. Birch.
Thank you, Mr. Dow. My name is Todd Birch. I'm a bus operator here at Lextran. I'm also the union president of Amalgamated Transit Union Local 639. As you know, Lextran, the union, has started negotiations for a new contract. The wage proposals Lextran has submitted is unacceptable by far. Wage comparison of the three closest transit agencies confirm Lextran falls way short of competitive wage. Currently, the starting wage for bus drivers at the Transit Authority of Northern Kentucky, also known as TANK, and they're in Covington, is more than 21% higher than the starting wage at Lextran. The wage after 1 year of service at TANK is 33% higher after 1 year of service at Lextran, 33% higher. After 1 year on the job at TANK, a bus driver makes more than a 25-year veteran at Lextran after 1 year of service. Top pay at the Transit Authority of River Cities in Louisville is currently 15% higher than Lextran. Cincinnati Transit Agency's top pay is also 15% higher. Lextran pays 13% less than the national average wage for bus drivers according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In addition, Lextran contributes only 4% to the employee's pension, where city workers are accredited with more than 20% towards their pension. That's 500% more. This is an embarrassment. Who's going to tell the workers that they're not worth a competitive wage? They ask me every day, what's happening? Are we going to get more pay? I see the pain in their eyes. Mr. Dahl, you assure me that the Lextran Board of Directors had every intention to keep the job at Lexington a great job. The proposal says different. The city is going to have to do better than that. The city and the board must make the wage respectable and competitive once again if employees demand it. Service improvement and expansion is non-existent due to failure to retain enough workers. Lextran faces cuts in service and employees cannot continue to quit due to below average wages and for a higher paying job that they can secure elsewhere. The dedication and commitment of those I represent is second to none. We're a very committed bunch. It's time to show them they're appreciated and respected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Birch. Appreciate your time. Is there anyone else for public comment? Okay. We will have to skip approval of minutes lacking a quorum. There is no chair's report today, so we will move into the performance report and financials.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We'll go ahead and go through the performance report for June. And we'll start this morning with our mission statement. We serve people and our community with mobility solutions. So several highlights for the month of June. We held open interviews each Tuesday in the month, and those accounted for 50 of 59 interviews that were conducted. Looking back through the fiscal year, that was our highest month for interviews as well. And a big kudos, a big thank you to the entire human resources team, but specifically Angie, Greg from our maintenance department, and Julie from community relations for being available and making sure that the candidates were cared for and seen to in a timely manner. Avail, our CAT AVL organization, was on site the second week of June to work with our staff on discovery for the implementation project. On June 18th, we officially opened the Versailles Road bus stop, bottle stop, with Mercedes Lawrence mural, and you can see her in the corner in front of her beautiful artwork. We did observe Juneteenth on the 19th with no modifications to service. And then we participated in Emergency Management's heat plan for 8 days total in June that provided free rides to people experiencing homelessness to cooling centers. Additionally, you'll see this as we move forward in the performance report, but there were 379 fewer days of lost time this fiscal year than last year. And then also, just of note, our 5310, we received the 5310 grant applications on June 21st, words are hard today, June 21st, and the awards will be announced soon for those applicants.
Emily, quick question, the heat plan, is
Yes.
that a decision that we make, or is that a decision that is directed to us by emergency management?
It is directed to us by emergency management. They have a specific protocol that's laid out, and we are a participant partner in that plan. John McNeil does work with the EOC for emergency matters. This would be one of them, so he's notified. And depending on the phase of the heat plan, we have sort of different considerations. So there's phase 1, which our focus is getting people experiencing homelessness to cooling centers. Phase 2 expands the number of cooling centers and opens that up to the entire community. So as the heat plan changes, our participation changes, but we are a participant in their program and don't typically have sort of any say about this is the threshold, that is the threshold. That's determined by emergency management and those teams.
At any point, does it change our routing, or does it just change who's eligible?
It does not change our routing, it changes who's eligible. To my knowledge, all of the cooling centers that we participate with are en route and don't have any deviations or anything like that necessary. Some, as it moves forward, some of the public pools open and are free and that sort of thing, so those may be a little further off route in some areas, but it doesn't change any routing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. John, did you have anything to add about that? Okay. Okay, so for June, for fixed route, we followed the typical trend. We did see sort of no significant change from June of 23 to June of 24 with ridership. It was pretty typical for what we see this time of year, and we have the monthly average has sort of come back into the fold of what we're doing in a pretty significant way. For paratransit ridership, we did see a slight dip in June, but we are continuing to move forward. So overall, there was, like I said, no significant change from June of last year to June of this year. Pretty typical for this time of year. We do see a dip in the summertime. One thing that we did note is that on Saturday and Sunday on both systems, we did have an increase in ridership from May of this year, but there's no significant trend there. It was just a sort of an interesting tidbit. And we are still ahead on the fiscal year, so an overall increase in ridership. We're ahead on the trips per mile, the trips per hour, and both systems are continuing about 9% above the previous fiscal year. For safety, there were 3 preventable accidents. For fixed route, 1 preventable accident. For paratransit, and if you go down to the days of lost time, you'll see that significant decrease from 23 to 24. Maintenance continued with 100% with 58 of 58 preventative maintenance inspections, and we had 10,640 miles between road calls. Any additional questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Good morning.
Morning, Nick.
I'm going to start with the balance sheet. It's hard to believe the fiscal year is over. We still have some adjustments to make, so as you notice, this is marked unaudited. We will have the final version when the audit is presented to you. But this gives you an idea right now of where we stand. Our operating cash is still at a strong point for this time of year. As you know, we won't see much property tax until November, so also accounts receivable, we have some adjusting entries to be made for year end that we did not have time to make before the board packet, so we will be doing those. Our work in process, that's grant money that we are owed, so we will be working on that. Some of those are open projects that we'll continue to see, is like the CNG facility and things like that. Everything else looks very comparable to last year, and if we don't have any questions, I'll go on to the budget versus actual. Any questions? Thanks. All right. Okay, we are very pleased with the way the budget looks for the year end of 22. Our revenue still looks a little out of ordinary right now because of the federal funds, but that's not an issue. We will receive those in the next fiscal year. Same thing with state funding, so there's no need to worry there. We just didn't get the money before June 30th. We ended up with our advertising revenue. We budgeted $260,000 per our contract, and we came in at $301,000. So we're pleased with that. And we have property taxes. Right now, we came in at $23.8 million. Last year was $22.7 million, so that's always good news. Our expenses are under budget. We have our wages are under budget. That's where we have vacancies, as you know, but we've also had a lot of overtime. So between the two, we have ended up a little bit under budget because of the vacancies. Our fringe benefits were under budget because of insurance. We budgeted really high last year according to the broker for insurance, and it came in a little bit less than what we expected. So there is some savings there from that. Professional services, that's mostly contract maintenance for the facility and some environmental costs that we had budgeted for that we didn't end up needing. We've had some savings. Our maintenance staff we budgeted for painting, and our maintenance staff was actually able to paint, and they did a great job, so that saved us some money. So we're thankful to them. We've also had some repairs that we didn't need for the building. We tried to budget some funds for the building since it's now 8 years old. Things are out of warranty now, so you have some repairs. So thankfully, we didn't need to do a lot of those. Our bus parts were a little bit over budget, but it's actually less than we thought it would be, so we're very pleased with that. Diesel came in, this time last year, we paid $1.2 million for diesel. This year was a little less than $800,000. Our year-to-date average for the entire fiscal year for diesel was $280. This time last year, it was $333. Last year, the highest diesel got up to $447. And this year, the highest diesel got up to $338. So we're happy to see that. We've also had some savings with that because we've used more CNG this year. And so we like CNG. We're thankful for that. Our paratransit expenses came right in where we budgeted. This was, as you know, this was a hard one to budget because it's based on ridership, and we came in right at budget. And we'll put that savings that we had from Vanpool, 55 toward the cost of the paratransit. Our dues and subscription, that's for our APTA dues. They're based on our budget, so it goes up a little bit every year. But everything else we're very happy with. But I'll be glad to answer any questions.
So for federal revenue, are we anticipating the same thing we got last year? How much are we anticipating?
We're anticipating about $7 million.
Okay. So that should be.
Yeah, last year was higher because of the remaining COVID money. So this year will be about $7 million.
That should take care of the deficit then.
Pardon?
That should take care of the negative delta.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other one is paratransit expenses. It's jumping year after year. Any idea how it's gonna be going forward?
We budgeted, a little bit for increase in ridership for the new year. So we expect it to be, a little bit higher than this year, but yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
You always do a good job.
Thank you.
Very proud of you.
I'd like to introduce my finance manager, Allie Jones. She's been here with us for a couple months, so we're happy to have her. She took Stephanie Hope's place, and she hasn't been able to come to a board meeting yet, but we're happy to have her.
Good to meet you, Ally.
Good to meet you. Any more questions? Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay. Seeing as we still lack for quorum, unless Mr. Schoninger joins us, we will have to forego action items, including the nominating committee and a resolution for electric motors. Is there a change order report?
There is, and it is for information only. There are 2 change orders, excuse me. The first for Cummins, that is our engines, rebuild engines. So there's a list of parts that goes into engines and engine cores. I don't even begin to tell you that I understand engines to this level, so Chris might have to jump in and help us out. But, some of those prices did go up, and these are reflected here in the change order. So if there's any questions, I will probably deflect those, but we'll make it happen. So then the second change order is for Crow, and that we brought to the board's attention last month. There's an additional $3,000 the first year, and then $1,000 for each subsequent year. So we're making sure that we got that correctly reported. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And those are the only 2 change orders for the month.
Okay, excellent. Any old business?
No.
Any new business?
Yes, we'd like to welcome Mr. Chris Avila. He is the director of the Lexington Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. He is going to walk us through the role of the MPO in the transportation planning process.
All right, good. Yes, good morning. So thank you for having me here, and some apologies up front. I am on the backside of a cold, so I may pause every once in a while, but if I start mumbling and you can't understand me, just throw something and I'll do better. So I need to make sure that this is working. Yes, it is. What we want to cover today is what is the MPO? This is something we haven't done before you in a while. And so you may not be familiar with what the Metropolitan Planning Organization is, or what the federal transportation planning process might look like, and more specifically how Lextran fits within that planning process. We want to cover a few things about federal requirements and some of the key documents that we work with. And then at the end, we've been asked to have a little bit of a discussion on the concept of microtransit, because we know that you've been heavily involved in that conversation, and we've had a lot of input directed at us about that concept as well. And so we want to have a little bit of a discussion on that, on some of the research that we've done related to that. So the MPO's fundamental role here is to establish transportation goals for the region and to basically conduct a dialogue with our various regional transportation stakeholders, of which Lextran is an important one. The Kentucky Transportation Cabinet is another important stakeholder, but so are our member governments, whether that be LFECG, the City of Nicholasville, Jessamine County, etc. And the whole point of, or the original purpose of the MPO was to bring local input into decision-making involving federal dollars, and more specifically federal highway and public transportation dollars. In fact, if a exercise is, or a project is using those dollars, it must be vetted through our process to make sure that our local elected leaders agree that that is an appropriate use of those funds. MPOs are required for all areas that have an urbanized population of 50,000 or more, as determined by the U.S. Census. And because of the size of Lexington, we actually are designated as a transportation management area. The good news is that means we've got additional resources that come directly to us from the federal government. Also means that we have additional responsibilities, and probably the more significant of those is the fact that we have to have a congestion management process. So we actually cover more than Fayette County. We actually cover Fayette and Jessamine counties, and there has been some discussion by some about whether it be appropriate to extend that boundary to other counties around us. When we look at our total population, we're a little under 400,000, and we represent about 458 square miles. Now, because we're representing a little bit larger area, even though we are LFU-CG employees and we operate underneath LFU-CG, we do have a separate transportation policy committee that governs the MPO. It's primarily elected officials, but we also have representatives from KYTC, Lextran, the Federated Transportation Services of the Bluegrass, and their responsibility is to not only determine regional transportation policy, but also to adopt the federally required processes that we must incur. We do have 3 advisory committees that advise the policy committee. One is our Transportation Technical Coordinating Committee, and they look at things from a technical perspective and provide recommendations on projects and the various documents that we are required to adopt. We have a Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee, which, as the name implies, focuses on bicycle and pedestrian mobility across our region and trying to make those 2 modes of transportation a viable option for folks within Lexington. And then we have a Congestion Management Air Quality Committee. Again, the name is descriptive of what they focus on. And so we're interested in making sure that folks can get from point A to point B safely and in a reasonable amount of time. But we also want to make sure that the potential air quality impacts of the transportation system are acknowledged and that they're not being a problem for the folks within our region. So I mentioned that the Transportation Policy Committee is the decision-making board for us. They approve all federal funding expenditures for our region. But they're also required to adopt several performance targets related to highway safety, travel time reliability, pavement and bridge condition, but also public transportation safety and highway and transit asset conditions. Now, we rely on Lextran quite a bit for the targets related to public transportation, and since I've been here, we've generally chosen to support whatever targets you feel are appropriate for your system. There are several guiding documents that are important to us. Probably the most important is the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. This is a 25-year planning horizon document that identifies our regional transportation goals, but it also identifies the projects that are intended to use highway and public transportation dollars. The current plan goes out to 2050. Now, the most important thing about the MTP is that it is a fiscally constrained document, meaning that we have to do an estimate of funding available to our region during that time frame. And any projects that are more expensive than what we think we can realistically afford cannot be included in that document. And that has implications on whether you can actually do any work on that project using federal dollars. So the next document is our Bicycle Pedestrian Master Plan. This is not required of us under the federal program, but we feel it is an important extension of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, as we are trying to make those 2 modes of transportation a viable option within our region. Now, once we get past the MTP and the long-range vision of the region, how do we bring those projects that have been identified to implementation? And that is the role of the TIP. And as we'll mention in a little bit, We're actually going through the process of adopting a new tip as we speak, and there's actually an opportunity for folks to comment on what we're recommending tonight, and we'll go into that in a little more detail a little bit later. The Unified Planning Work Program, I basically refer to as the operating budget for the MPO, but the reason why this is relevant for our discussion today is that any kind of study that intends to use federal dollars, any kind of planning study has to be identified in that work program. And so we often have a number of transit-related studies that Lextran is using federal resources for, and so we want to make sure that those efforts are identified in that document. And then finally, as with everything else in the federal program, we have to identify a plan on how we're going to solicit public input into our process. So we have a participation plan that details how we're going to solicit that input into our decision making. So the way our process works is we have a start at the very beginning, and we have it's kind of an inverted pyramid here, sometimes referred to as a funnel. And at the very top, we have what we call the universe of projects. These are all the suggestions that folks have asked us to consider as a potential project or there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And then we do an analysis of all of that as part of our Metropolitan Transportation Plan. That plan was adopted back in April. Then we go through the exercise of prioritizing those projects and identifying what needs to move forward in the next 4 years. And that is our Transportation Improvement Program. And once we get something identified in the TIP, then that's when the bulldozers show up. Or in the case of public transportation, that's when the buses hit the street. So what we want to do now is kind of go through a little bit of a discussion about some of the trends that we're observing through the year 2050, how that translates into some of the recommendations that were long-term recommendations in our transportation plan, and then identify some of what we think needs to be implemented in the next 4 years, and focus more on the transit recommendations for your to get some input from you. So one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that as a state, Kentucky is looking at diminishing population growth relative to what was being forecast previously. This is also true nationally as well, but for Kentucky, the forecast, which we use from the Kentucky Data Center out of the University of Louisville, basically forecasts that the state is going to be pretty flat through the year 2050. Now, Lexington is still expected to see growth during that period. In fact, Fayette County is expected to be the fastest growing county during that time period, but it still is about half of what was previously being forecast prior to the pandemic. The other big issue is this increasing cost of transportation. For the first time ever now, it's estimated that it's about $10,000 a year to own and operate a motor vehicle on average. And for folks of limited means, this is a real challenge. And the goal is that an individual or family should not be spending any more than 15% of their income on transportation costs. And when we map this out, we see that there are a lot of areas where the median household income is not sufficient to meet that threshold. And so public transportation obviously has a very important role to play in trying to make sure that people have the ability to get to the important destinations of life. We are looking at an increase in freight flows and tonnage. That's maybe not directly relevant to Lextran here, but is something that we have to account for when we're planning for our arterial corridors. There's an emphasis on becoming carbon neutral by 2050, and LFUCG has accepted that policy, and so we are trying to identify opportunities to basically reduce the carbon footprint of our transportation system. The other big trend is trying to make sure that all of our streets are complete streets. that they're accommodating for all potential users of that system. And far too frequently, most of our, or a lot of our system is focused primarily on automobiles and not other modes of transportation. And then finally, some would argue this is the most important goal. We have a goal of eliminating traffic fatalities and serious injuries by the year 2050. And so we are trying to identify opportunities to help us achieve that. So there are 6 overarching goals that the MPO Policy Committee has adopted, safety being first and foremost. But we also want to make sure that every citizen here has affordable and equitable transportation options to be able to participate in the critical activities of life. And just going through some of these others, resiliency, making sure that we're able to recover from some sort of disruption to the existing system. Economic development, we're always looking for opportunities to have folks increase their ability to generate wealth and make sure that they have a good quality of life, which is goal number 5. And then, of course, we want to be able to balance all of our various environmental, social, economic needs between our natural and built environments. And the transportation sector has an important role to play in that. So I'm going to show you a couple of several maps here from recommendations out of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Most of these 2 initial slides are focused on highway and bicycle and pedestrian projects, but there is an important one along the Nicholasville Road corridor, which comes out of the Imagine Nicholasville Road study. And there is an important transit component to that project, which is now being evaluated by KYTC through a feasibility study, and that is the bus rapid transit concept that came out of that plan. And so we're expecting some recommendations later this year from the consultants that are working on that, and hope to have a conversation about next steps early next year, and how do we get some enhanced type of transit service along that corridor implemented. For public transportation specifically, we've identified several projects to basically transition the Lextran fleet to clean or no emission options for the future. I think we recognize that CNG is probably the transition short term, but that eventually that's still a fossil fuel. We have an interest in seeing that we have something else, whether that's battery electric, whether that's something else. We're not 100% sure, but we are working with and committed to working with Lextran to make sure that the fleet is zero carbon emissions. We've also had some conversation about Lextran wheels. I understand that that's going to be a continuing conversation even later today. And so the policy committee is committed to working with Lextran to improve, not just improve the quality of that service, but also the reliability. I've mentioned about Nicholasville Road, but we're also working with our other transit providers within the region. VG Cap Transit is probably the more significant one, and they are providing intercity bus services currently from Nicholasville into Lexington. But there are proposals to provide similar services from Georgetown and Frankfort into Lexington as well. And then we also work with Federated Transportation Services of the Bluegrass, who of course are the Medicaid provider, Medicaid transit provider for Fayette County. So let's talk about the Transportation Improvement Program. This is the implementation part of our process. And these are projects, and actually really work phases of projects that are ready to be implemented within the next 4-year time frame. And so we have a draft of the new document, which if adopted will take effect October 1st, and will cover fiscal years 2025 through 2028, although this is the federal fiscal year just to make things extra confusing. To be included, there are three things that have to happen. First, you have to have the project identified in the transportation plan that I just mentioned. The second part is that it actually has to be ready to begin, and we have several definitions about what we mean by ready to begin. It depends on what phase of work you're talking about. But probably the most important thing is that we actually have a formal commitment to fund that phase of work in the next 4 years. And that's sometimes a stumbling block, especially if we're cobbling together multiple sources of funding, which for a large project is becoming more and more frequent. And so when we look at when is a project ready for design, basically it just has to be identified in our MTP, but this kind of is a bit of a layered approach. If we're acquiring right-of-way, the design has to be complete. For utilities, we have to have the right-of-way in place if we're relocating utilities. And then for construction, basically everything above has to be in place. Transit's a little bit different. We don't have construction necessarily, but there are certain services like bus rapid transit where there is a design component to that. And so before something like an enhanced service can actually take place, we need to have that design phase complete, which also includes the necessary environmental reviews that the federal government requires. So what we're looking at for Lextran here, we obviously identify the day-to-day operations and preventive maintenance costs that Lextran does, and we do have to identify those line items in our tip. But any kind of vehicle purchases, and there are several, they're identified. So for instance, electric buses, electric vehicle recharging. And we do have a new pot of money called our carbon reduction program. This has come to us from the federal government out of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And the first project that we funded with that was the purchase of a battery electric vehicle for Lextran. And so that's part of the conversation that we're going to continue having about how do we use those funds. And so I won't go through each one of these projects here, but this is what's being proposed currently for the next 4 years. Let me add a little caveat here that we're going to have another process this fall that's going to be an actual call for projects for use of dollars that we call our sub-allocate dollars. These are federal funds that come directly to the MPO and are under our purview to assign to projects. It's probably somewhere around $10, maybe $11 million a year. And what we want to hear from our communities is how should we be using those funds? And we're going to accomplish that through a call for projects. And so be on alert for that, and we'll be working with Fred to make sure that that word gets out and that Lextran is at least able to provide some applications if you're able to meet the federal match requirements for that. And shameless plug here, I mentioned that the new tip is out for public comment right now. We're looking at having the draft document adopted by the policy committee on August 28th. And tonight we are having an open house at the Marksbury Library between 4 and 6. So if you're interested in the tip and want more information, staff will be available to answer any questions. And we also, of course, have a lot of information about what the tip is and what's being recommended. So finally, the staff has asked me to provide a few slides about microtransit and the concept. We know that you've heard from a lot of folks on this topic. We've heard from the same folks. And so what we thought would be helpful is let's have a discussion about what is microtransit, how are other communities using that type of service, and then is this a good fit for the problem statement that has at least been presented to us. So what is microtransit? The micro in microtransit typically refers to the size of the service area, not to the size of the vehicle. Most communities identify an area of about 3 to 5 square miles. Sometimes it's a little bit less than that. And what is common to these areas is that they often have a concentration of a transit-dependent population, but it's difficult to serve them with a traditional fixed route service. Or there may be a particularly high demand to get to a particular location. And so the example I've got here on the map is from the city of Milwaukee. And what they're trying to accomplish here is that in the blue area is a neighborhood with a high transit-dependent population, and they're trying to get them access to a job center on the south side of town, referred to as the Franklin Business Park. And so you have high unemployment in this area. The city has identified an interest to make it easier for those folks to be able to access those employment opportunities. This is a typical application of microtransit. Other communities have also identified things like food deserts or access to medical services as an appropriate use of microtransit for a particularly small area. Some other characteristics of microtransit from other communities is that it's often a curb-to-curb service, but not always. Sometimes it's a corner-to-corner service, or maybe there are specifically identified pickup and drop-off locations that you must meet the vehicle at. These are also generally shared rides. So this isn't an individual going from one location to another. You may have as many as 8, perhaps as many as 10 people, depending on the vehicle being used. And it's not a direct connection necessarily. The other characteristic is that if you're trying to get to or from the areas that are outside of the designated zone, it generally requires a connection to the fixed route service. And so there's not, so it's not an everywhere to everywhere type service like Uber and Lyft. There are limitations oftentimes. Now, like anything else, there are some variants to this. There are some cities that have decided that we're going to provide a demand response service for our entire city. Arlington, Texas is probably the most notable example of this. But when we look at those cities, there are a couple of caveats. These are cities that have a relatively small transit-dependent population, especially relative to what we have here in Lexington. They also don't have any fixed route service. Arlington, Texas has always been that way, and they've made a decision that for the foreseeable future we will continue to be that way. And they actually have a population very similar to Lexington. And so what they do is they use their $5307 that come to them, and instead of using it for fixed route, they use it to provide this demand response service. The other characteristic is that these communities also generally have a higher household income than Lexington, and so their tax base is a little bit higher to be able to support these types of services. And as we'll see here when we talk about cost in a second, this is a very significant cost that you have to have an honest conversation about. How are you going to fund that service? There are some services that have been dedicated to tourist zones or a sports and an entertainment district. Downtown Memphis is a prime example and probably was one of the early examples of that. But it's catered to people who are staying in their downtown hotels and trying to access places like Beale Street or the FedEx Forum, for instance. And then Arlington, Texas has a huge sports complex, and the hotel district is actually physically separated from that. So they've used a demand response service to be able to provide out-of-town folks that connection.
Can I ask one question before we move
Yes.
off that? I just want to make sure we're getting our definitions straight. Is demand response the same as on demand?
Not necessarily. So I guess it depends exactly on how you define it. But what we've found is that for some of these other communities, it could be as much as 20 minutes or longer from the time you ask for the service before they actually pick you up. So I guess it depends on if you feel that's an acceptable length of time or not.
I guess the question being, so let's use, for instance, the Memphis
Mhm.
example. That is a ride that you request,
Mhm.
not a dedicated
That's
loop that is
correct.
connecting point to point.
That is
or zone
correct.
to zone. Okay.
That is correct. And you basically have to use their app to be able to utilize the service.
Judge Thurston, did you have a question?
No,
Okay.
okay. Yes, and feel free to continue to interrupt me if you've got a question.
Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about funding. One of the things that we've seen with other communities is that the per trip costs are generally pretty high, $50 to $70 per trip. I believe Arlington is in that $70 range. Most of these communities have one-way fares between $1 and $5. And again, they're shared trips. So you may have, if you have 10 people there, that may be enough to cover the cost of that trip, but often you don't usually have that number of individuals there. And so there is a significant amount of resources that's got to come from somewhere else in order to make these systems work. And I've given a few examples of, so for instance, Milwaukee has a grant from their state workforce innovation program, but that expires in 2025. Memphis is using their congestion mitigation air quality funding, which in Tennessee, all those funds are given directly to the MPO. In Kentucky, we have to compete for those as a competitive discretionary grant that is administered by KYTC. Important distinction there. And then I've mentioned already about Arlington where they're using their $5307. A lot has been mentioned about the fact that there are a number of FTA grants that are out there that are new to the, as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law. While that is true, FTA basically has significant questions about what is the long-term funding sustainability for those programs. They're very reticent to provide a one-off grant that may cover 1, maybe 3 years of operations, but you don't have a strategy for maintaining that system afterwards. And so these grants are often viewed as perhaps initial seed money to get the service started, but they want to see a sustainability plan for you to continue the service into the future. The other challenge is that these grants are often very competitive. Typical success rate is probably in the range of about 1 out of every 5 applications is successful. I've seen some programs where the success rate is as little as 1 in 20. So that's something else to think about, and these applications cost money to put together and submit. And then there's always a 20% non-federal match that you have to add to this. And so if this is an option, you very early on have to have a very honest and open conversation about how are you going to fund it and how are you going to continue the service into the future. So let's talk about what we've heard. And I believe this is consistent with what you've heard. And there's the problem statement that was presented to us that persons with mental health challenges find it difficult to access existing services, or that those services are unreliable. Now, it was followed up by maybe something a little more than a suggestion that a privately operated microtransit service would be the appropriate solution to that. And so on the surface, I think the more we look at this, we kind of feel that maybe that's not the right fit, but Lextran is going to be looking at this in more detail and bringing in some outside folks to take a look at this a little later this fiscal year. And so we're reserving judgment until those folks have had a chance to take a look at what are the realms of possibility. Now, It's possible, in fact, probably likely, that there may be other areas where microtransit could be a significant benefit, kind of akin to what the city of Milwaukee is doing, and trying to target certain transit-dependent populations and providing them better access to employment opportunities or to some of the important destinations of life. I think Birmingham cited food deserts as a big issue for their microtransit service. And I believe Chattanooga, it was medical services in addition to the food desert question. So there may be opportunities for microtransit to be a real benefit here. Is this really the best way to address the initial problem statement? I think we're reserving judgment at this point. But there are some important questions that I think need to be answered as part of this process. And one is, how would the microtransit service be different than the wheel service that currently exists? And are we talking about replacing the wheel service, which is required by federal statute? How would eligibility be handled? We're talking about folks with mental health challenges. What is the training requirements for the drivers? Would they be able to handle a mental health emergency if it should happen when the vehicle's in transit? Of course, we have to talk about funding. How would that, and if we're not able to get a discretionary grant from some sort, how would that expect it or impact your existing services? And then we also have to talk about the federal charter regulations, because at least what's been proposed about a citywide demand response type service akin to Uber or Lyft is, how do we keep that from being perceived as competition to a private company that is interested in providing that service? And the federal regulations kind of frown on you competing against those types of operations. So these are some of the things that we're going to continue to think about into the future, because we continue to get a lot of feedback on this particular question. Our policy committee, or some members of our policy committee, have requested a dialogue on this at our next policy committee meeting, which is scheduled for August 28th, if you're interested in that. And then I just want to wrap up here by saying thank you for this opportunity to brief you a little bit on what we do, what your role is, and I think we're always interested in having that continued dialogue on how do we improve transit services for our region, and how do we improve the mobility of the people that we serve.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, it looks like now we have quorum.
Well, Jamie had to drop off.
Oh, she dropped, so we lost one again.
We lost one.
Okay. Gotcha. And so we cannot enter into a closed session as perhaps suggested without that. So let's review proposed agenda items.
Sure. So the list that we have already established was the committee appointments, so we'll have to back up and also do the nomination committee. That's okay to do next month?
Or
Okay.
you can schedule a special meeting and do all the notice things that entails.
Okay.
If you want to, if everybody can get together soon.
Okay.
Or you can wait.
We'll talk about that, but I'd say most likely we'll probably wait until next month.
Yeah.
We're looking to bring a resolution for paratransit vehicles. That comes from our grant award, our $4.2 million loan grant that Emily and her team brought home for us, so congratulations on that. So what that allows us to do would shift the federal 5339 money that we would normally get from our formula side and shift that into paratransit. So what we would normally have spent to make sure that our fleet replacement on the fixture outside was staying up to date, we can now shift that over. So we'll bring that a resolution before the board next month. Also, a resolution for fuel. then the resolution for electric motors. I think we'll bring all that together. We anticipate that our 5310 grant award winners will be announced at next month's board meeting. And then looking forward beyond that, as Chris mentioned, the microtransit work, we're looking probably at a September task order. And Mr. Gregory Butler, our Planning Community Development Manager in the back, will probably be taking the lead on scoping that out. So the idea is that at our September meeting, we would issue the task order to begin that study formally. We're going to wait to hear what comes of our discussion in August from the policy committee, incorporate that into the scope. And that is, at this point in time, our plan to move forward on microtransit.
Great.
Thank you. I do believe that is all that we have planned for next month.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your time. We'll stand adjourned.
Thank you all.